quarantine comes, I wasn't next to him. Mongolia. Whatever you have in your minds, it's going to be absolutely intriguing. When I was in the fourth grade, my class went to the American Museum of Natural History in Manhattan. And we were given 20 minutes on our own right before lunch to go anywhere we wanted to. And I ended up in the dinosaur exhibit and was introduced to a man named Andrews. And Dr. Andrews was the man who in Mongolia dug up the dinosaurs. And that has been in my heart ever since. Mongolia has been that special place that is over the horizon, that is on the bucket list that I will never see. Our presenter this morning is a new friend of mine. Jeffrey Robertson is the man you go to when you're at St. Andrews University. His cover story is that he is the director of development, but it's like the CIA. That's just the cover. He is the man who is the EA to the president. He is the guy who moves around that campus as an instructor, and he is the go-to guy. Every organization should have a go-to guy. Jeffrey is a retired commander, United States Coast Guard. The Coast Guard is the loveliest service you can imagine. Its informal motto is, you have to go out, you don't have to come back. Isn't that neat? They are the best people in the world. And so I'm thrilled that Jeffrey is with us this morning to talk about his time in Mongolia, to introduce us to a place that is so other. My friend, welcome.
Thanks, Bob. One of the things I've learned about Bob is that I need to be careful because I can always tell when he's lying, and it's usually when his lips are moving. But I appreciate that, Bob, and I agree with him about the Coast Guard. I also learned something about the Navy when I was in the Coast Guard, and that is that the Coast Guard is the strong nucleus around which the Navy forms in time of war. We used to tell our Navy friends that, but I enjoyed my time in the Coast Guard. After the Coast Guard, I served as Assistant Commissioner of Customs for a couple of years. Got involved in working in industry in Northern Virginia. I can't tell any lies this morning. My wife is sitting over here, so please, she's going to hold me to this. As we had these journeys, Phyllis always was there alongside of me, even in Key West, where we had number 2, her favorite place in the world, I think, one of my favorite places. After I did some work in consulting, I had an opportunity to get involved in nonprofits. So you may wonder, what's a coastie doing in Mongolia? Well, I started working with some nonprofits. I worked with an organization, a startup in Northern Virginia, training lawyers in third world countries on human rights. After 2 years there, I actually had a friend reach out and say, there's this organization in China who's looking for a boss, and I think you should do it. I'll pass along your resume. Well, I said, I don't think I want to go to China. I spent about 8 years as the president and CEO of Agape Asia Foundation, and that's when I had the opportunity to spend some time in Mongolia. I'm going to share that with you. And then after an agreement with the board that I was really going to do this for 5 years because I replaced a founder who was in his late 70s, and we had some founder syndrome going on in the organization. I stuck to my word, but it lasted 8 years at Agape, and I'm currently on the board with them. And then received a phone call from a recruiter who said, what do you think about higher education? I said, you're talking to a Coast Guard guy here. What do you mean higher education? And so I had an opportunity to come here to St. Andrews, and I'm currently working here. So folks say, how did you get here? Kind of a long journey, but sometimes I just don't question when God opens doors. If it's the right door, you just walk through it. In 2014, I started working with a then known as Chinese Agape Foundation. We merged with an organization in India. We became Agape Asia. In 2017, I received a call from a friend in China who said, Jeff, you need to come to Mongolia. They have these issues with children living under the streets, in the sewers, in different places, and they really need what Agape Asia does. So after convincing my board, doing some research, there's a great book called There's a Sheep in My Bathtub. If you ever get a chance, read that. There's a guy named I think it's Dan Hogan, lived in Mongolia back in the 70s and 80s as a missionary, learned a lot about the country, spent some time understanding Mongolia. After the next year in 2018, I actually traveled over there, and it really was just scratching the surface on the country. As I've told my wife, I will go back. She doesn't like to travel, so I'm not sure I'll be going together with her, but we'll be traveling back over next year. That's part of the plan. Our board, Agape Asia's board, is going to be heading back over there for a couple of projects. But I absolutely fell in love with the country. It was even more than I thought it would be. What I'd like to do is introduce you to Mongolia, what I learned about the country. We're not really going to be able to, I'm not going to tell you the dinosaur stories. That is a big part of what happens in the country. But Mongolia is much more than that. It goes much deeper, much more history than just the discovery of those fossils. The country actually ties back to a person. And what I want you to think about, if you know anything about Mongolia, and if you don't take anything away from today, I want you to remember the guy that you see in the statue. The statue is a silver statue on the outskirts of Ulaanbaatar, which is the capital, UB, the capital of Mongolia. And this is the gentleman we call Genghis Khan. All right? If you call him Genghis Khan in Mongolia, they will not know who you're talking about. In their language, he's Chinggis Khan. Okay? Chinggis Khan. Mongolia, if you could describe the country, all you need to know about is this individual. Because his personality, his ethos, his impact, the influence that he had on this country formed it into what it is today. Now, the history and the legacy of Mongolia and the steppe people in Asia go back many centuries. Those of you who spent some time studying European history probably have heard of a variety of different bands of northeastern Asian horsemen that made their way through Europe. They made their way from the gates of Rome down into Egypt, down into India, and they ruled a greater part of the world. In about 1200, this young man who grew up in a broken home ruled the world. Genghis Khan took his troops, took his people outside of their little small villages, and there is not a lot there, and they actually threatened most of the empires in the world. This country carries his heritage, they carry his DNA. In fact, looking around, I don't know if this room, it's true, but according to legend, 2/3 of the people in the world actually carry Genghis Khan's DNA, especially in Eastern Europe and Central Europe and Southern Asia. So not only did he have a lot of influence culturally, he had a lot of influence in terms of heritage as well. So if you ever go to Mongolia, understand that it's a country that was formed by this man 800, 900 years ago, but his influence is still carried forward today. And I'm going to go into that. I promise that we'll get through this. It may be hard to finish up before noon, but Bob guaranteed me that he has a hook. He's going to pull me off. I'm going to show you some of the words on the screen are actually going to be in the Mongolian Cyrillic writing. Now, that was influenced by the Russians. The Russians did move into Mongolia back after the revolution in 1919, I think is when they made their way into Mongolia, and absolutely destroyed the country. What they have today is you have what's left of the Russian Empire in terms of the buildings and the influence of alcoholism. 2/3 of the people in the country actually are alcoholics. And that's part of the reason that Agape Asia was there, one of the things we worked with. But the other thing they left with them was the alphabet. But the Mongolians, true to form, they modified the Russian Cyrillic, and they added a couple letters, and they have their own alphabet. It's sort of, if you understand Russian, and most Mongolians under the age of about 40, they had to learn Russian in school, because when the Russians left in the 90s, they left lock, stock, and barrel, and the country tried to pick up what the Russians had left. And what they did is they had a broken education system, a broken economic system, but lots of resources and people with the heritage of Genghis Khan. And that's kind of the way they describe themselves, that they will always be around because of their Han. You'll see the language here. They actually, the Mongolian native language is a much more beautiful script, and you're starting to see that. They're resurrecting it in the country. I don't have any presentation here. There may be a couple of examples, but just be aware that their language is a very throaty language. I will not attempt to replicate it, but if you've ever heard of the tuva singing, have you ever heard of tuva? throat singing, all right? That's a good representation of what their language sounds like to music, right? But their language is very different than ours. But fortunately, Mongolia is considered a third border country. Anybody know what a third border country is? It's a very unique relationship with the U.S. You don't need a visa to go into Mongolia. When you land in Mongolia, and after your flight from the U.S., you probably have flown into Germany or into, I flew into Seoul a few times, you go through Beijing. Once you land in Mongolia, they basically stamp your passport, you don't need a visa. You're good for 90 days, and you could just walk back into the local U.S. embassy, and you're good to go for another 90 days. So no visa required. But it's a third border country. Lots of exchange takes place between the U.S. and Mongolia. There's a large U.S. Chamber of Commerce. AmCham Mongolia is very powerful, very influential, lots of businesses. But why do you think that may be? Does anybody know geographically where Mongolia is located? What's the country to its north? Russia. Okay, what's the country to its south? Fairly important countries to the U.S., right? So Mongolia hates the Russians and they hate the Chinese. We get along very well with them, right? So again, my time there, it was very open. I found that the Mongolian people were very friendly. I found that they opened their homes to me, but there are some significant challenges they have in their culture, and that's what my organization, Agape Asia, was there for. But as I describe the country, I'm going to try to describe it in a couple of different ways, and it starts by understanding geography. So I'm going to talk about the city, and there really is only one city in Mongolia. Anybody know what that is? Ulaanbaatar, UB, as they call it. The city makes up about 75 to 80% of the population of the entire country. The state itself is larger, the country is larger than Alaska, but it has a population of about 12 million, 13 million people, and that may be different. That's the number, the last number that I saw. 75 to 80% of the population is in about 5% of the area of the country. Right in the very heart, UB is a western city. You fly in, I've got a photograph here I want to show you. When you fly in, this was actually flying into UB back in, it was July of 2018. There are actually mountains. Sometimes I didn't know what to expect. When I got there, I realized that there are actually some hills in Mongolia, but there are loads of flat grasslands. A lot like Minnesota, Montana. All right, if you know the open, grasslands of the West, the U.S. West, that's very much what it's like. But UB is in the center of the country, and it's actually circled by hills. The legend has it that when Genghis Khan made his way back after exploits throughout Europe and Asia, this was a place where the Buddhists had established some centers of worship. He moved his yurts there. They still live in yurts in lots of areas in Mongolia, and this became his capital. It became a spiritual capital around Buddhism, but also his capital that he created the government. Beautiful, beautiful area, lots of water. It's not a desolate area, but this is July. It's not January. As you look at the city, this is just an overhead shot looking down out of one of the hotels. Interesting architecture. If you take a look at the building in the center with the red roof, if you've ever been to Eastern Europe, if you've been to Russia, you see their architecture. Loads of the architecture in UB was put up by the Russians. So between 1920 and the 1990s, lots of architecture, and it is in just as bad a condition as Eastern European architecture. If you take a look in the background in the center, this is Sulkabatar Square, and in the back of that, in this area right here, is the national, the parliament. It's where parliament meets. It's where the national government meets. So that's their center of government. I have some photographs in that area. But if you look at the city of UB and you think, wow, Mongolia is a Western country. Yes, it is. They have five-star hotels. They've got some great restaurants, but they have some extreme poverty. And just imagine this city. If you look out on the hillside in the background, those are slums, okay? You have yurts, you have houses that were built in probably the 40s, 50s, 60s that are falling apart. We're going to show some of them to you. But this is a country of contrasts. But you have to understand that it's really a city. Sorry. My watch is smarter than I am. It's a city that's encircled by the country of poverty. Now, there are other cities, if you know anything about Darhan, which is a city out to the west, it is an area where they found copper. There are some rare earth metals in Mongolia, so they're very American and South Korean and German companies have been exploiting that since the Russians left. So there are lots of minerals that come out of that country. But in terms of the country itself, you need to understand that it is a large plain around one city that makes up 80% of its population. And what that creates is the center of wealth is here, but also because the Russians were there, they love to take vacations. So the folks that live in the city have their country homes. And so they go spend the summer in the country just as the Russians do. So some of the practices of the Russians have carried over into the Mongolian culture. Beautiful city. I was hoping that I would have two young ladies from St. Andrews here with me today because we actually have two students from Mongolia. Both of them are freshmen here on the ESL program. They're learning English. So again, their education system in Mongolia is growing. They have a very solid medical research and business program, but the vast majority of their education system is just not up to Western standards yet. What I found is that a lot of middle managers and businesses have come from the U.S. I was out in Darhan visiting that area and meeting with the local, the leader of the social services. Come to find out, he had come to the States. He had grown up in the far western part of the country. A U.S. aid worker had come in and lived in his town. He learned English. He came back to the States. He got a scholarship, and he went to Case Western Reserve University, but also went to, I guess there's a high school there, Case High School. So I find that there are some middle managers that have come to the States, and they're now the folks that are building up the industry and the economy in Mongolia. These are folks that they're not educated in China, they're not educated in Russia, they're educated in the U.S. or possibly Germany or Korea, all right, South Korea. Those are the areas that have really influenced Mongolia since the Russians left. So this is a booming capital, and it is expanding. Just imagine these rings of poverty are being overtaken by new homes. They're being overtaken by new communities. So it's an interesting aspect of gentrification, but it's actually happening within that country as well. So Mongolia, you need to understand that it's a city. Another picture looking down one of the main streets out to the east. It's, again, beautiful, but do you see some smog? There's no air quality control. You know how they heat most of their homes? Coal, right? So that smog is not just dirty, it's nasty. A high incidence of lung disease. Children have some significant issues with breathing problems. Architecture, like I said, and traffic. So they have their share of traffic. The government has really been pushing hybrids. And so when I was there, there were lots of secondhand Japanese, mostly Toyota hybrids in the country. So the government's trying to improve that. They're trying to address it. But in a country that has an average winter temperature of minus 10 degrees, and that's Fahrenheit, okay? It's really hard to try to convince people that you need to use electricity to heat your home. Coal's cheaper, yet coal affects their environment. I learned an interesting tidbit while I was there. Does anybody know at what point this is not education, it's not a class of education, but at what point does Celsius and Fahrenheit meet? Anybody know what temperature that is? I never would have thought about it until I was in Mongolia. Minus 40. Look it up. Minus 40 degrees is the same Fahrenheit and Celsius. I didn't realize that, and I really don't ever want to have to experience it, but my Mongolian friends taught me that. They're used to it. They actually encouraged me to only travel over there in the summer, spring, or fall, and in fact, their spring is about a month. It usually lasts from the beginning of June to the end. Their summer is July and August. September is their fall. By October, it starts snowing, and by January, it's minus 40. So very difficult country, very difficult place, but just understand that the city of UB is the center of the country, and it really is the heart of the country. This is the National Parliament building. You notice in the center of the building, there's a large character that I was telling you about. This guy dominates everything in that country, even here at their parliament. Everything about Mongolia, they look back and they say, Genghis Khan. He is our, I mean, again, that is the focus of what they do. Also in the city, there's a lot of culture. This is, they have started cultural dances and cultural performance in country after the Russians left. This is actually in a theater that the Russians had built. The Mongolians now use this for their national performing arts center. But again, this is not a country that doesn't have art. It has some beautiful arts. The music of the country is beautiful. But again, primarily in the city. That's where the culture is, in the city. At least what I would consider the Western culture. Let's talk a little bit about the countryside. This is the image that I always expected to see when I went to Mongolia. And trust me, that is the image I saw for 12 hours when I took a train from Ulaanbaatar up north to the border. I'm trying to recall the name of that town. And then another 12 hours west to Darhan, okay? 24 hours on a train to travel about, I think it was about a 7-hour drive, because we drove back. We rented a car. But it only cost us $12 to go over there by train. And it cost us $25 to take a cab, right? 7-hour cab ride for $25. But hours and hours, mile upon mile, of nothing but sheep, goats, camels, horses, cattle, yak, and beautiful mountains. I actually experienced the grass. I went out a few times to kind of check it out, and trust me, it's not something you want to go lay down and spread out and enjoy yourself, because it is some nasty little critters in that grass. It's tough, very hard. It's nothing like I'd experienced. But the countryside in Mongolia, you have cities in different places. This is just to the east of Ulaanbaatar. The river here runs down through UB. This is an area to the east. Beautiful mountains. Do you notice where the trees grow? Not necessarily in the mountains. There's not a lot of trees. It's too cold. That's part of it. But also the legend is that the Mongolian, that Genghis Khan and his people cut the trees down to support the war effort. So basically they built chariots and they built things to move the war supplies when they moved to the west. They basically cleared out the trees on the way. But I'm with you. I think it's too cold to grow. However, I'm going to show you some shots of some of the beautiful landscape. Again, think Eastern Europe. The architecture's ugly. It's poorly built. A lot of these buildings have to be completely reconstructed about every 20 to 30 years. Major renovations, about every 20 to 25 years. This is along the rail lines, and this is on the outside of UB as we were going out to Darhan. This is a good example of the roadways. There's actually pavement on this roadway. Lots of the roads in Mongolia, once you get outside of UB, you don't have pavement, okay? Fences, walls around buildings. This, again, looks like it could easily be any other country in Central Asia. Anybody that's ever been to Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan or any of the stands, very similar in terms of the people, the language, the culture, but there's much less Russian influence here today than in those countries. Again, this is a little small industrial area. There are lots of little small industry. People have to keep vehicles running. They have to have pumps for their wells, right? They have to have refrigerators. So you get a lot of same type of small industry in the countryside, but it just doesn't have the kind of resupply and the kind of resources that we do. The last weekend I was there, we actually traveled out to the east side. I'm going to share a story with you later. But we actually stayed in a yurt campground, or as the Mongolians call them, they're called gers, G-E-R, ger. The most of the other folks in Asia call it yurt. People in the rest of the world call them yurts. The Mongolians don't like that. Notice the stone mountains. There's not a lot of this. This is an area, just a lot of rock outcropping on the east side of UB. Beautiful area. We camped out there. This was in July, I think around the end of July. Any idea what the temperature was like? 65 during the day. Beautiful, nice open skies at night. Yes, there are fireplaces in there, and I'll show you some in a second. It gets down below freezing. I mean, it's about 25 to 30 at night, and these people were happy. They walk around without socks. I just can't do it. No, those are all rocks. And this is actually just a canopy. That was a canopy that we had dropped. No. But within a month or two, they would start getting snow. By the beginning of September, they would start having snow. Again, beautiful trees. This is along one of the little streams there. This is where we were camping out. So again, the countryside is not all plains. It's not all grassland. It's not all mountains. There are some trees, but it is very rare. This is another site across the country. There's only one rail carrier, and it's the Mongolian government's rail carrier. They don't have a fast train. So if you've ever been to China, if you've ever ridden one of the fast trains, no, you don't have that in Mongolia. This was the train station in Ulaanbaatar as we left to go up north and then make our way further west to Darhan. There is not a direct rail line from Ulaanbaatar out to the west coast. They have a few lines connecting them, and they were originally built by the Russians, right, to move their military, to move the troops around. So the first line was built from the border down to UB. So everything has to go through these old rail lines that were built by the Russian military. And then now most of the lines are actually used by the miners, and lots of resources that move along the rail lines. And then there's a couple of lines. I think there's one line to the east, one line that runs south, one north, and then the one from the north runs further west. There's nothing directly to the west. However, around UB, loads of people travel by train. They actually, it's not a public transit system, but they have stations around town that you can jump on the cargo train and go from one station to the next. It's real unique. So we talked about the people, or we talked about the city of UB. We talked about the countryside. The other thing that really stands out in this country is the poverty, which is the reason I was there. And I really spent a lot more time focused on that. But I think it's important to understand that the situation in Mongolia, if you've ever traveled and you've gone to another country, you understand that there are differences in the way people live in other countries. However, I think it's important, at least for me, when I was trying to understand Mongolia, is how did these people get in this condition? What are the situations, and how do you start addressing it? This is just a sample of a village, not a great photo. It's a sample of a village on the west side of UB. The first little area I visited, and that is a container. That is a 40-foot IU shipping container that you see there. People living in that. There's some construction, fairly decent construction, and this is probably a middle-class neighborhood. Not exactly the standards we'd expect. When it rains, it pours, and that is just a gully down the street. Lots of privacy. People respect their privacy. One of the things I failed to mention earlier when I talked about the countryside is there's no such thing as property lines in Mongolia. They actually, when you go out and you take your sheep and you move your goats from place to place, there is no property lines. You have no personal property, so you can't have a farm out there. However, farmers work that area, but they will move their sheep from one field to the next, from season to season, and that goes all the way back to their ancestors, who were the early settlers or the folks that lived in this area, and that was their practice. In fact, now they will pick up their cattle, and if they have cattle, if they have sheep, they have horses, they will actually move them every season to a different place, a different pasture. So again, property lines, but when you get inside the capital, when you get inside the city, everybody has their property. They have property lines. Here's an example of a little house. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Yes, to keep people from running into the fences. It's like here. I'm not sure, but I saw it in lots of different places. I never really asked, but that's, I found some other stuff. We'll show you some other stuff that I really don't understand the reasoning for it, but I would think it's probably just to keep people off the fence, or maybe to provide a sidewalk. There were kids out playing in these areas when I was there. Here's an example of one of those little living areas. The organization that I mentioned to you, when Agape Asia got into the country, one of the things we realized, before we got there, we knew we needed a nonprofit, a charity to work with. So our practice is we actually have partners in each of these countries. So we help them establish their own charity. And so the lady that we work with, I think there's a picture of her. Her name is Salango Gambat. And she is a social worker. by training. And we helped them establish this with a couple lawyers and other folks in town. We established a charity, and that organization works with the social services. There is within the government, they do have a local social service organization, way underfunded. And so they're constantly asking for Westerners to come in, Western Aid, other organizations like Agape Asia to come in and assist them. And they actually provide access to these locations. So these social workers, just like here in the States, most of them are trained here in the States. Remember, I mentioned the guy from Case Western. They will go into these homes. They will intervene. There's a couple things I learned. I have a talk about alcoholism earlier. About 2/3 of the population, according to estimates, are alcoholic. The problem was the Russians made vodka too easy. It was very easy to get alcohol into the country. Dealing with the challenges they have, alcoholism is just a huge, huge issue. Marijuana, not a problem. You don't have other types of drugs in the country. Now, I'm sure there are some criminal syndicates trying to move some stuff through there, and they probably do, but it's not a major issue culturally for them. Alcoholism is their problem. The other issue is unemployment. About 60% unemployment in some of the rural areas, 60. So yes, 60%. So what you have is parents, as they raise children, we're going to get to the horse racing in a few minutes, but they are a culture built around animals, okay? The kids grew up on horses. Remember going back to Chinggis Khan? We're going to talk about the Nadam festival in a few minutes, but that was how the Mongolians proved to the Han that they were worthy of being a soldier. And so they celebrate this each year through a festival, but from the time kids are able to walk, they work with horses. From the time they're about 8 or 9 years old, they're actually training horses, breaking horses, and they're working around horses. In fact, they have some horse gambling. They race horses in Mongolia, and the kids, because they're light, are the best riders. There's a high incidence of mortality among those kids because it's a pretty rough and tumble activity, and these kids just don't survive. So, but the kids make the money for their parents through the horse racing. But 60% unemployment. Prostitution is very high. There's also less than 25% of families, 25% of people who have children are actually married. How about that? So there's a very low incidence of marriage within that culture, right? Christianity is not a big thing in Mongolia. Buddhism is very strong, very high, but even Buddhism, I kind of describe it as if you've gone to Latin America, you know how the Catholic religion is very popular, but it's really sort of a cultural practice. And again, no disrespect intended for those who are Catholic, but if you know in Latin America, as you work with those countries, there's not a lot of Catholic practices that are actually part of the norm. Same in Mongolia. They have Buddhist in country. Animist is probably 75 to 80% of the country is animist. 30 to 40% consider themselves to be Buddhist and animist. So the religious practice in Mongolia is all over the map. Quick little tidbit. Those of you who may have known, Genghis Khan actually almost considered himself to become a Christian. There was one point in time where he came across, there were missionaries that made their way into Mongolia, and he thought about it. However, I'm trying to remember exactly the reason, but it was really a financial reason. He didn't think that they had paid him enough to make their way into his country. But the point is, he was a pragmatist. It would have been a completely different country if that had happened. But poverty is rampant in the country, and this is in the city. All right, this is. Oh no, that's a house. That's a house. It's a room, but it's a house. There's a family. There was a family of 4 living in there, and I'm going to show you a couple of the others. Here's your tires too. That's the other thing you do with tires. You hold your bed up with it. Yeah. Notice no electricity, no refrigeration, no toilets, no plumbing. Again, this is the norm. You got a little water bottle down here. This is some of the flats. If you were a little wealthier, you could make your way into maybe a government-supported flat. But this was only for folks who kind of identified and the government could prove who you were. About a third of the population they say are operating without any kind of identity. So a third of the population, no one knows who they are. They come out of the countryside. They come in to try to find jobs, and they end up getting caught up in. They lose a job. Their family breaks up. The mom goes back home with the kids. Dad stays there. Dad becomes a drunk living on the streets, or mom decides to give herself to prostitution. About a third of the country, they don't have identity cards. So again, lots of cultural issues that are tied to economics, but also goes all the way back to the birth of the country. And in my view, and I'm not, this is not politically oriented at all, but the very fact that the Russians were there and then threw their hands up and walked away.
Socialist?
No, it's democratic. They have an elected parliament. The parliament elects their speaker, and there is a president that's elected. Now, there's some debate. There's lots of, remember the 60 to 70-year-old guys and gals, well, guys mostly, that are leading the government. Where were they in the 1990s? They were the henchmen for the Russians. So they're going through a transition. It's going to be another generation before the Russian influence is gone. But unfortunately, that Russian influence has turned into alcoholism, prostitution, and other issues that is affecting the younger generations, right? So, is that what you were asking? I just, these flats, notice a nice little playground. You got a playground for the kids. No kids there. These were actually some of the social workers that I was there visiting with, attending this, visiting some of the families. This is what I saw day in and day out for 2 weeks. Little guy, probably 2 years old, 3 years old. Families in the background. Notice this is actually not their land. They've thrown up a yurt in someone's backyard where they pay rent, not even legally. They just are required to pay rent, nothing to document it. They don't have a lease. Usually you see this. You see grandma taking care of the kids, all right? Any different than a lot of places in the States? Nope, very similar. But you've got a grandmother who is providing for her children. Now this lady, quick story on her. Her son was in prison. He had been caught stealing. The mother had left the family. They had 6 kids. This was probably one of the middle kids. The oldest child was actually had dropped out of middle school. This little guy's probably 8 or 9 years old, and there were probably 3 under 5, under 4. Mom's nowhere around. Mom had gone back to the countryside. Dad stayed there. Grandma was there with them to come help take care of these kids because Dad had got picked up for shoplifting. Another picture just to give you an idea of how wonderful the architecture is. This is out in the countryside. There's actually a family living in that building. Notice a container back here to the left. This is sort of on the edge of town. But this family, the dad, when we got there, well, let me go to the next slide. Okay, this is what we found inside, right? Here's Big Brother who's taking care of the family. He's about 6. He's got a little 4-year-old and probably a 2-year-old. So I asked the social worker, okay, so what's going on here? Well, we don't know. Whenever we show up, there might be an adult here, but there's usually not. There's no food in the house, okay? We that's one of the things we did is we provided food, and we Agape Asia provides access to schools for these kids. So what we do is we allow them, pay for them to go to school. Because you have to have clothes, you have to pay for books, you know, there's things that, and in Mongolia you actually pay for public school. Makes no sense, but you do, just like in China. So I said, okay, where's Mom and Dad? He said, well, I don't know right now. They're probably in this area. Mom is usually in this building down this alley. Mom's a prostitute. Mom's making some money. She's making a few dollars a week. And Dad, the last time we found him, he was in the next town over, drunk. And he shows up now and again. that is the average family that we found in Mongolia. Now, if you're out in the countryside, you stay in your little shack and you hope that you can stay warm when it gets cold. In downtown UB, they had, and I should have described this earlier, there's an underground piping system. They have thermal energy in Mongolia. Very powerful. I mean, it's a amazing system. But it also provides hot water. It heats the water, and they pump hot water around the city. The first night I stayed there, I said, okay, I don't see a hot water tank. And I stayed in just a flat. I said, I don't see a hot water tank around here. They said, oh, no, just turn that handle on there. I said, okay, but where's the hot water come from? Oh, the government gives it to us. They literally pump, it's about 150 degree water is pumped all around the city. Okay, now imagine fast forward to the 1990s when Russia left, there was extreme poverty, even worse than it is now. Kids started moving into the underground piping systems, and that's where these kids were living. In fact, some of you may have seen that there were several videos that were put together back in the 90s and early 2000s on the hundreds of kids that lived underground in the sewers. And because that's how they could stay warm. It was nice and warm down there as opposed to minus 40 above ground. If you're out here in the countryside, mom and dad haven't done anything to provide some fire, you just grab a blanket if you can and you warm up with your little brothers and sisters, right? So this is how a good portion of the country lives. This is Salongo. She's my friend. Real sweetheart. Those are police on the left. This is a children's prison. No gas. I didn't hear anybody say, really? How many people knew that there was a children's prison in Mongolia? How many people know that there are children's prisons anywhere today? There are some in different places. However, it's been outlawed by the UN. However, the Russians consider this a juvenile detention facility. It's a 1950s vintage Russian prison that was turned over when the Russians left. The local police said, we've got to do something with these kids. We've got all these little varmints running around, pickpockets, causing all kinds of problems. And so, from the ages of 12 to 18, if you're caught, you get to go to the children's prison. They call it a juvenile detention facility. It's prison. We couldn't show, the one guy did turn around. We're not supposed to take pictures of their faces. This was my second visit. First visit I went there, I wasn't allowed to take any photographs. As we were making our way around UB, the very first trip, Salongo was in the car with me. There was a social worker, and as we were making our way around the area on the east side of town, it's called Nalakh, Nalaikh, Nalakh. Salongo said, the social worker wants to take us to the children's prison. I've had translators before, so I'm going, yeah. Okay, yeah. And as we got closer, we pulled in, and it was a rundown, ragged, and I probably should have put a slide in here, shaggy building with really good security around it. And I said, Salongo, what kind of place is this? You said children. She said, oh, no, it's for children. It was for children, all right? There were 12-year-old kids in there. There were kids that were rapists. There were kids that were in there for assault. There were kids that had murdered others. There were kids in there, about a third of the kids, according to the warden or the sergeant in charge, about a third of the kids were turned in by their parents because they knew they'd be fed because they couldn't be fed at home. So you've got families that have some value, they have some understanding, they have some care for their kids, but you turn your own kid in for theft so that he can eat? That's what they did. So the reason we went to visit this place is because the local police official heard that we were in town. There's a Western aid group here. Bring them here. Would you help us? They don't have enough money to operate this facility. They had toilets that weren't working. They had bathrooms that were a disaster. Half the bunks weren't functional. They had a room that had some computers in there from the 1990s that were not working. They had classrooms for the kids. And I immediately said, yes, of course we can. I don't know how. And on the way back, I mean, literally, I was on the phone. I was calling back, and it was late at night, and I called one of my board members, Phyllis, remember, I called Dan, and I said, I don't know how we're going to do it, but I just committed us to take care of a children's prison here. And he said, yep, We'll figure something out. And so we still work in that prison today. We've been involved teaching. They have English classes. They have regular classes. Salongo goes in there. We have a values class. I don't know if anybody's heard of character counts, a curriculum. Actually, there was a lady in our small group over in Knoxville before we moved here. She designed that curriculum. I was sharing the story about Agape Asia with our small group, and she said, Jeff, she's from East Tennessee, Jeff, when I was at UT, he said, we designed this thing called character counts. Now, I think I can still get you use of it if you want it. And Peggy, sure enough. Nadam, I'm running out of time. I got 15 minutes. In the 1200s, when Genghis Khan would decide who did he want to be, who was going to serve in his army, he said, I need warriors who can fight, who can shoot, who can ride. So he tested them, and it's turned into this. The entire city goes out to the countryside to watch 15 and 30 kilometer races on these horses. They also come out in camels, but this is their festival day, all right? This is a camel. He was fun. I rode him. Look at the kid on the right. Anybody know how old he is? I have no idea, but I'm going to say he's probably 6, maybe 7. These kids were getting ready for a 15-kilometer race. They took off riding off into the distance until I could see nothing but a cloud. And then they disappeared. And of course, they had a radio. They had a helicopter flying over top of them. And they were broadcasting it back. And, the speaker was broadcasting what they were doing. I had no idea. And then about 30 minutes later, these kids come riding back. Some of them didn't have riders on them. Some of these kids are just falling off the horses. Notice these are not thoroughbreds. They're not quarter horses. These are step horses, okay? Shorter legs, hardier, but they are not the same kind of horse that we have here in the States, okay? They probably have a good time at the equestrian center, but different kinds of horses. So one of the things they do during Nadam is they have horse races every day, dozens and dozens and dozens of races out in the countryside. Then they come back into town and they go into their big sports pavilion, the big park. This is actually a stadium. And they recognize the winners. They bring them before the governors. You got the old guy shooting arrows, all right? So they test archery. They compete, my favorite, all right? Some of the world's best wrestlers. If anybody follows wrestling, international wrestling, some of the top wrestlers in the world are Mongolians, okay? But they have their own version. It's not like freestyle. It's not Greco-Roman. They grab those straps the guys have around the waist and they throw each other down. It's about throwing each other off balance. This goes back to 1200 when Genghis Khan was testing his troops, and if you couldn't compete, you were not part of his army. He also did this to train them. This was part of their training to keep them in shape and condition, and riding and shooting and wrestling. As we start wrapping up, let me tell you a couple stories. 2 stories. First one is fast food. I learned that there is fast food in Mongolia. Did you know that? It's not McDonald's. They do have McDonald's there. But as we were going out to those yurts, I showed you the picture of the last weekend I was there. We went out and camped out for the weekend with a group of, with the team that we work with. As we're driving out of town, I said, hey guys, we're going to take some food out there because it was a camping trip. They said, yeah, you will get some fast food. I said, okay. All right, I'm trusting. You learn to trust a lot when you go to other places that don't speak your language, right? So I trusted. And as we're driving down the road, we pull in to a little parking area, and there's these trucks with rails on the back, and there's goats and sheep inside. I said, this is weird. And look, and it's a fence around this. What is this? And Salongo said, no problem. It's fast food. I go, fast. Could I have fries with that? Okay. So keep an eye on this little guy right here. I promise I won't go in too much in depth, but that little guy became dinner. You know where the story's going. I didn't show you the pictures of what happened inside, but basically, as we pull up, my friend Arendava, I called him Eric, he got his 6-year-old son out and said, let's go. And they walked up to the truck and they said, that one. And they took him inside, and along inside the wall to the left is a little slaughter ring. And basically, Eric and his 6-year-old son slaughtered that sheep, put it into plastic bags, and we went camping. Fast food. Now, I know you didn't want to get into this, but I was amazed when I sat there and I watched them slaughter that sheep, because my image went back to my faith, right? And I see this image of this little sheep, and he just sat there and he laid down and didn't say a word. Anyway, pretty amazing. They don't waste anything from that sheep except its voice. Every piece of that sheep is used. They buy his fur, the skin of the sheep. They use it they're at the retreat or at the facility. Everything else, everything, including the blood of the sheep, comes back. This, my friends, is a Mongolian barbecue, not what you go to and have a Chinese fried food, okay? Mongolian, that is not Mongolian food, trust me, right? It may be Inner Mongolia. This is a Mongolian barbecue. Yes, they're putting hot rocks inside a bucket, all right? Inside this bucket goes everything. The sheep's blood, there's milk, there's all of its intestines, all of its meat, everything goes in, and it cooks all night. Now, the first thing they pour off in the morning is they pour the liquid off, and we have what they called milk tea. And it's very milky, milky plus, right? It's got lots of fat in it. The most valuable piece of that sheep is his tail, because it's got more fat in it than any other part of the sheep. So this is how we cooked our meal that night. We took the sheep, prepared it. Next morning we get up, and I think I put this, yes, this is breakfast. Now look at this, potatoes, onions. What do you not see? Green vegetables. Mongolians are not vegetarians, people, all right? I learned that if you go anywhere and you expect to get some kind of vegetable meal, now you will get some tubers and potatoes and maybe some onions, but if you don't like meat, you will not enjoy your time in Mongolia. These young ladies that are here as students, the very first thing when I spoke to them, I said, how's your time here in school? Very good, but there's not any meat. Chicken is not meat. Lots of chicken. This was my Mongolian barbecue. If you find one of those in the States, call me, we'll go. Milk tea, one of the most amazing, crazy stuff I've ever had in my life, but it's basically sheep's milk cooked in with all the fat, very rich. The other thing I didn't go into is they drink horse milk. Anybody ever heard of that? Phew. It is rancid stuff, all right? They let it, it's like a beer. It becomes very soured, and they keep it on the shelf inside their yurt. And when you go to visit, guess what? That's the way to welcome you. And they don't just give you a little glass. They give you a bowl. And you're going to sit there and drink it with them. That's the way they welcome you to their home. Wow, this stuff was nasty, but it's strong. It's actually soured horse milk that is turned into an alcohol. Before you leave, and I want you to take away the two things, right? One is Mongolia really is about Ulaanbaatar. The city is the country, right? Remember Genghis Khan. But I want you to remember my friend Mukerdin, okay? The reason we went back to Mongolia was what happened with my little friend, all right? This was his house on the right. It was an entrance into his yurt, and I don't have the picture of the whole thing. But 12-year-old Mukerdin welcomed us as we walked up into his village on the west side. I'm trying to remember the name of the little village. Anyway, the west side of Ulaanbaatar. And as we get up there, we'd gone to the school. In fact, the school, one of the social workers from the school says, let's go visit some of the children that are not in school today. So we go out, we go to Mukerdin's house. As we get there, this is how he greets us. I'm like, man, what a chipper little guy. Okay, you've heard the story before. Where's mom and dad? right? Mom's probably one of the houses somewhere nearby, making some money in prostitution. They don't know where dad is. He disappears. He falls into alleys. He may come back. He may not. He's in there taking care of his two younger siblings, all right? He's not going to school because he can't go to school, because he's got to make sure that his 6-year-old and his 2-year-old are taken care of. He's feeding them. It struck me, but we spent probably an hour with this little guy, and just the best attitude and behavior. Just, you know, you don't ask him, say, don't you wish you were in school? No, he says, I'm caring for my family. My family's important. I get back home, and Solango calls me about a month later. I'm calling and checking on what's going on. I'd made a proposal to the board. We're going to go into the children's prison. We're going to do some of this other stuff, but I don't know about caring for kids. Solango says, you know, Jeff, you remember Munkardine? I said, yeah. I said, he got foot and mouth disease. I said, okay. Did we give him some antibiotics? She said, no. There's no medical care out there. Munkardine died a month later. Okay. So where's his brother and sister? They were the first 2 kids that we took into care. All right. So we started sponsoring kids now. We got about 300 kids that are there now that we provide for. We pay for their clothes to go to school because they have to have uniforms. It goes back to the old Russian practice. They have to be able to pay for food. They have to be able to pay for some books. So we provide care for these kids so they can go to school, but we also put food on their table. We go to visit them once a week, make sure they have food, and we get them involved in after-school programs and a variety of other things. So Munkardine is the reason that we're there in Mongolia, not only the children's prison, but he's the reason that we have gone back to care for these kids, because you know what? Moms and dads aren't really around, but we want to try to make sure that there's a next generation of moms and dads that do take care of their kids. So I've given you a broad brush. I told you why I went there. This is not to promote Agape Asia Foundation, although I could talk about them all day. Mongolia is a place that there's nothing like it in the world. And I still don't understand it completely. I'm learning a lot of stuff about it, but it is a place that I'll go back tomorrow if I could. If I could take my wife, I'd go maybe the day after.
Questions?
Yeah, questions.
What is their currency?
They, well, officially or unofficially, they use dollars. You can also exchange rubles, Russian currency. There was talk about euros, but they primarily operate in dollars. On the southern border, the Chinese like to get yuan in there, but it's dollars. Yes, sir.
This is an awful question, but I'll ask it anyway.
Sure.
What kind of money does the mother make as a prostitute?
About 50 cents a day. Yeah. Yeah. So again, remember the practice here, and I could spend a lot of time just talking about the way Chinggis Khan worked and how he operated. But basically, when you went in and destroyed a village, all the men were killed first, and then the older women were killed second. Then you killed the kids, and then it was a matter of which of the younger women would be productive for us to take with them, keep us occupied as we were traveling to the next town to destroy. That's how the Han worked, and as they destroyed these little towns and villages. So you have this practice, almost every place that I went. You notice the lady I'm working with, I'm not working with a guy, I'm working with a woman, Solango Gambat. The women basically dominate that culture. They run that culture, they run the society, because men are delinquents. Just be straight with you. Another thing that, and I don't know if I've ever shared this, I've told Phyllis about this, but when I first got off the plane, Solango and I'm trying to remember the other lady's name. There were 2 or 3 ladies that came to meet me, along with Solango's daughter. Where's Dad? He left. Yeah, he's not with them anymore. So I walk up and I shake hands with Solango. Okay, well, you notice I'm not a very tall guy. Solango's about 5'10" or 5'11". Her hand enveloped mine. What I learned as I went on is that the women milk the cows, the women run the farms, the women are involved in industry, and so they are the physically dominant people in this culture, and the men, they're not running off to war anymore, so they're bored. That's my take on it. And they're drinking, exactly. But that struck me, and again, it's probably a very terrible thing for me to say, but I was amazed at the physical prowess of these women.
When you adopted, or took on these 2 kids, did they still live at the same place,
Yeah.
Where do they go to school?
They still live there. They go to the local school. The social workers are working with dad and mom. Dad at least is around the house more often, but the social workers are there 2 or 3 days a week. We've tried to get dad into alcohol rehab. The fact that they have food now, mom doesn't have to work as much. Not that her money was really doing very much for her to begin with, but that's what they're trying to do. Again, they're not doing this just out of a sense of trying to have a good time. They got to survive. They got to put food on the table. So we're taking away a lot of that challenge, and we're also providing opportunities and programs for the kids that they didn't have before.
Kid gets to be 18, he hits school, what does he do?
There is a conscription in the military. They're required to serve some type of social service time or military time. There are secondary programs. There are vocational training programs, but most of the jobs are outside of Mongolia. It's for both, for men and women. In fact, Salongo's sister lives in Sri Lanka, or Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and she's working down there as an IT professional because there were just not many jobs there in Mongolia. So that's going to be the challenge. Is there's not a lot of natural resources. There's not a lot of things internally other than mining. The Western countries have pretty much taken all the mining out of there. The government has got a lot more ownership of the mining than they had in the past, but still, it's less than half. Most of the money goes to either Korean or U.S. or German companies. Yes, sir.
At the festivals, is Buscasi part of their competitions, or is that just farther to the west?
I think that's in the west. The Nadam is just these three. I'm not familiar with Buscasi. Is that out in Kazakhstan or? Okay, yeah,
It's in the steppes.
got it. Yeah, these cultures are very similar, and in fact, their languages are very similar. They run together. The Mongolian, the traditional Mongolian script is very close to Arabic, but it's actually more flowered and colorful in looking at the writing. It's beautiful. I'd also encourage you to follow tuva singing. If you've never listened to throat singing, it's amazing. All right, I'm past 12. I'll be glad to stick around and answer more questions, but I appreciate you providing the time and hope you learned something.
Jeffrey, deeply grateful. Absolutely. A place we have never been, a place we're never going. It's not Laurenburg, that's for sure. But thank you for the insights, thank you for the wonder, and thank you for Genghis Khan. Friends, lunch. Be careful, COVID is among us.